Good evening, everyone. Hell's Unicorn here again, and with the passing of this Lord's Day, we have had a fair bit of news. One bit of news is that the city of Aleppo is finally able to observe open Christian worship for the first time in 5 years. This is very good news for the people of Syria and very bad news for the Islamic terrorists funded and created by America's CIA and with cooperation from Saudi Arabia and various other Wahhabist bigoted nations. Nevertheless, the more interesting bit of news and very heartbreaking news for many people out there who are music fans is the passing of George Michael. To get into a little bit of my own background with his music, he was quite a big name back in the 80s when I was a kid, and it was impossible not to be in the car with the radio on and not hear one of Wham's greatest hits, be it Careless Whisper, Wake Me Up, or that Christmas tune that they penned during that time period. One thing I will say for George Michael, he had quite a voice on him, and he always made a point of associating with very talented musicians and could really throw out a good catchy hook for anybody who liked music with a melody, particularly music that was easy to move to and easy to have stick in the memory. Naturally, the recent passing of his life has brought about certain questions and may cause some to reflect a bit on some of the drama that followed his life. And I find it both necessary and prudent, though perhaps maybe a bit controversial, to get into some of the more dramatic points of his life, particularly his post-Wham period in the 90s, and particularly the late 90s. At the age of 19, George Michael had told several of his close friends that he was bisexual. And he had also told one of his sisters this. However, he kept this information from his parents. And this would continue throughout the 80s. And he had stated, particularly when looking back on his time with Wham in the 80s, where he was basically engaging in sexual relations with both men and women. I used to sleep with women quite a lot in the Wham days, but never felt it could develop into a relationship because I knew that emotionally I was a gay man. I didn't want to commit to them, but I was attracted to them. Then I became ashamed that I might be using them. In 2009, he was further quoted as stating, "My depression at the end of Wham was because I was beginning to realize I was gay, not bisexual." It's sort of an interesting thing that a number of prominent gay musicians, particularly gay men, and actually if you look into most lesbian entertainers and prominent figures of said persuasion, there is always a period of flux or confusion about one's sexual orientation that either precedes and in some cases also may follow the self-discovery that one is of a same-sex relations mindset. I would argue that this is so primarily because the source of the confusion is not with the hetero side of the bisexual coin, but with the other side, and that this confusion is further fostered by various societal influences that were coming into play in the 1980s and were already well underway previously in the 70s, but became much more prominent in the 1990s. And with that, we'll move on and focus on a bit more of some of Mr. Michael's later relationships. George Michael established a relationship with Anselmo Filippa, a Brazilian dress designer whom he had met at a 1991 concert. That was the Rock in Rio concert. 6 months into their relationship, Filippa discovered that he had HIV. Michael later said, "It was terrifying news. I thought I could have the disease too. I couldn't go through it with my family because I didn't know how to share with them. They didn't even know I was gay." In 1993, 2 years later, Filippa died of an AIDS-related brain hemorrhage. Now, just to chew on this for a second, this was discovered 6 months into the relationship, so we can safely assume that there was sexual encounters going on between these two prior to this. Hence, those who are speculating that Michael's untimely passing being the result of a long festering AIDS infection are not without merit, especially when you look at pictures of him later on in his life. But continuing. In 1996, George Michael entered into a long-term relationship with Kenny Goss, a former flight attendant, cheerleader coach, and sportswear executive from Dallas. They had homes in Dallas and a £8 million mansion in Highgate, North London. In late 2005, it was reported that Michael and Goss would register their relationship as a civil partnership in the UK, but because of negative publicity and his upcoming tour, they postponed it to a later date. In August 2011, the opening night of his Symphonica World Tour, George Michael announced that he and Goss had split 2 years earlier. Goss was present at Michael's British sentencing for driving under the influence of marijuana in September 2010. Moving on from his long-term relationships, we get into perhaps a even less savory part of George Michael's life, particularly in the late 90s and beyond. Questions of Michael's sexual orientation persisted in public until the 7th of April 1998, when he was arrested for engaging in a lewd act in a public restroom of the Will Rogers Memorial Park in Beverly Hills, California. In 2007, Michael said that hiding his sexuality made him feel fraudulent, and his eventual outing, when he was arrested in '98, was a subconsciously deliberate act. Michaels was arrested by an undercover policeman named Marcelo Rodriguez in a sting operation using so-called pretty police. In an MTV interview, he stated, "I got followed into the restroom, and then this cop, I didn't know it was a cop, obviously, started playing this game, which I think is called I'll show you mine, you show me yours, and then when you show me yours, I'm going to nick you." And to which he pleaded no contest. Question obviously is that if the officer did actually show him his, why would he have reciprocated unless he was in the habit of doing things like this on a regular basis? And then we get the answer to this a bit later. In July 23rd of 2006, Michaels was again accused of engaging in anonymous public sex, this time at London's Hampstead Heath. The anonymous partner was stated, wrongly as it turned out, to be 58-year-old Norman Kirtland, an unemployed van driver. Despite saying that he intended to sue both the News of the World tabloid, who supposedly photographed the incident, and Norman Kirtland for slander, Michaels stated that he cruised for anonymous sex and that this was not an issue in his relationship with partner Kenny Goss. What this means is that the relationship that he had at the time was open and that he was in the habit of going around and sleeping with other men. And if you read the statistical averages for gay men who cruise, the numbers of potential partners could be anywhere from a dozen to several dozen. It was also revealed that Michaels had a little bit of issue with drugs. I'm not going to get too far into it. He was a marijuana enthusiast, which I'm not going to fault him for, but he did get into some other stuff. Now, what is interesting is that later on in his life, Mr. Michaels started to develop some health problems. In 2011, October, Michael canceled a performance at London's Royal Albert Hall due to a viral infection. On November 21st, a hospital in Vienna admitted Michael after he had complained of chest pains while at a hotel just 2 hours before his performance at a venue for his Symphonica tour. The singer was later confirmed to have suffered from pneumonia and until the 1st of December was in an intensive care unit. While Michael appeared to be in good spirits and responded well to treatment following his admittance, on November 25th, hospital officials said that his condition had worsened overnight. This development led to cancellations and postponements of the remaining 2011 performances, which had been scheduled mainly in the UK. Now, it is a little bit odd for a person of a first world nation who is basically in his late 40s to be suffering from pneumonia to the extent that he was. So I think it can be rightly inferred that if he did not have AIDS, that Michael had some sort of other health issue that had manifested in middle age. And it was only a few years later, on this date, December 25th, 2016, where George Michael died of an undisclosed cause, although his manager has stated that he died of heart failure. I wonder if that was heart failure related to complications from pneumonia. So, what do we have to reflect upon here with the passing of George Michael? I guess I could sum this up by returning to the sad end that befell Freddie Mercury, another very gifted and talented musician and vocalist that I admired greatly. A person has come to an untimely end because of various lifestyle choices. Now, while some have argued, and maybe even rightly so, that the sexual tendencies that come with being a homosexual are not all immediately in one's control, and that these impulses may be tied either to genetics or, I would argue, most likely to certain environmental determinants related to a person's upbringing and surrounding influences. A person is always of an ability to exercise a certain degree of self-control, and it appears that these were issues that George Michael, much like Freddie Mercury back in the 70s, struggled with immensely. And these may well have been a reflection of the culture of the day. Particularly in the 1990s, there was a very, very heavily permissive attitude within the more progressive sectors of Western civilization towards sodomy. And no matter what your feelings on this issue, the health consequences for this type of activity, especially in its more promiscuous forms, is self-evident. If you look at the average life expectancy of a homosexual man, even in Western Europe and the United States of America, it is at least 20 years younger than the average white man who does not engage in these activities. If you look at black homosexuals, it's even worse. Basically, gay sex can kill you younger than chain smoking, which should really give you a bird's eye into the priorities of modern politics in Western civilization. Millions upon millions of dollars are spent in advertising to combat the dangers of tobacco usage, but the same amount of money, if not oodles more, is spent celebrating something far more deadly, it seems to me. I've had conversations about this throughout the past several hours of the day with friends and family, and I've gotten into a couple of heated exchanges over this issue because I've chosen to be bluntly honest about my views regarding homosexuality and what it does to people, particularly when it is allowed to run rampant. Some whom I've discussed this with that were of a more liberal persuasion started to infer that I got some sort of glee or joy at watching someone like George Michael die and being subject to some kind of judgment for what they've done. Nothing could be further from the truth. I hate having to make videos and commentaries like this. I would much rather, if I was on the subject of George Michael, I would much rather today be talking about George Michael Jr. going out and making a name for himself as a great musician or as something else, and George Michael Sr. being immensely proud of him. And if not that, I would much rather be saying, hey, George Michael's next hit song is actually pretty good. Isn't it great that he managed to limit himself to just one life partner, and even though he is practicing a sterile and, in my personal opinion, disgusting bedroom behavior, hey, at least he's not infecting other people with a deadly disease that is his to bear because of his own promiscuous activity. Do keep in mind that it was as early as 1991 that the AIDS issue comes into question for Mr. Michaels, and that he in turn was cruising for anonymous sex at least throughout a good chunk of the 2000s. How many other men have gotten sick and died because they had relations with this man? How often is this cycle going to be repeated before we start asking ourselves some serious questions about our priorities as a society? People can call me a bigot to their heart's content. It's not going to bring George Michael's back from the dead, and it's definitely not going to give him the one thing that he denied himself, which was life beyond himself. People say, ooh, his parents must have been closed-minded and bigoted people for not being able to handle the idea of him being a homosexual. What if that wasn't the case? What if instead the reason why his mother probably would not have been able to handle that is because she wanted some grandchildren and for Mr. Michael to maybe have a life beyond his own? And at bare minimum, even if not that, maybe she wanted him to end up somewhere other than here on this date at the age of 53. At least a good 20 years before the average life expectancy of your average British man. Do think these things through before jumping the gun and jumping to conclusions about what I've said here, please. I think this is a relevant subject, and I think it is particularly relevant to discuss this now because people are so emotionally distraught over this that they are not thinking about the whole picture, and they should be. With prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.